Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have a special guest with us today, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. Dr. Rediger is a licensed physician, board-certified psychiatrist, best-selling author, and popular speaker. He is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the medical director at McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. He also has a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. His research with remarkable individuals who have recovered from incurable illnesses has been featured on the Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Oz shows, among many others. He has been nominated for the National Bravewell Leadership Award and has received numerous awards related to leadership and patient care. And his best-selling book, which I highly recommend, is called Cured: Strengthen Your Immune System and Heal Your Life, is available at Amazon, local bookshops, and in multiple languages. Thank you, Dr. Rediger, for being here with us today. It is truly an honor.
Well, thank you for having me. Ditto.
So how about we kick things off with you sharing a little bit about your story and how you got into this type of research that you now do.
Yeah, so I was born into a very conservative family. My father came out of the Amish tradition. My grandfather was a blacksmith among the Amish. My family left the Amish community, or left that area, when I was 2 years old. And we lived on a farm about 35 miles away growing up. And so my parents left outwardly, but not so much inwardly. So it's a very conservative religious world. I was going to public school during the day, and then living in a very different world at night, where TV was suspect, the world was suspect, science was suspect, literature was suspect, radio, and all those kinds of things. And there was some great things with it. You know, mom and dad grew their own wheat at times, and so we would have these great whole wheat pancakes and bread and all those kinds of things. And I had a huge appetite, and people are tall in my family, so we had big appetites, and there was always lots of food. But it was very confusing in terms of the worldviews and how to reconcile the worldview at home with the worldview at school. And you know, I was a rebellious, questioning kid, and that was challenging in a home where questions were feared rather than valued. So I took off for college and ended up being excommunicated for decades after that. But college became a wonderful opportunity for me to begin asking these questions. How do you know what's true? Are we good or evil as human beings at the very core? How do we know what's true? And so these became burning questions for me, and I pursued philosophy and theology and psychology and part of that quest. And then in the context of that, ended up going to seminary at Princeton. My mentor there was writing books in theology with physicists at the time. So it's just this continued exploration of the relationship between science, both Newtonian, Cartesian science, and modern science, with theology and spirituality. And it's just a really great exploration. So I stayed and got the 3-year Master of Divinity. And on the way, became convinced that science is a limited but really important tool. And went to med school after that. And that was in part, med school was a way to, in part, reconcile my rural roots, where the emphasis is on something you can do that's practical, and still have room for my questioning, somewhat tortured questions. So then after all that, I finished residency and was asked to start a center at Harvard with a mentor. In 2002, I was a new young medical director and faculty member, and a nurse, an oncology nurse at Mass General in Boston, came to me and asked for help explaining her recent diagnosis of pancreatic cancer to her son. And I worked with her to do that. She took off for a healing center and began calling and writing me saying that she was experiencing an amazing healing. That's quite a story if it's true, because pancreatic cancer, pancreatic adenocarcinoma, is usually a fatal cancer, almost always, if you can't remove it surgically. And hers wasn't. And so the expected prognosis for her was a certain brutal, painful death. She began getting better. She was going through this transformation in her life in front of my eyes. And she asked, since I'm a physician and have this background in theology, would I look into this? I declined, thinking that there's nothing probably outside of traditional worldviews for us to understand here. But then she began having people call me from around the country and elsewhere saying that they had medical evidence for their recoveries. Did I want to hear their stories? Although I declined for a while, the truth is, after a while, I began to see that these stories sometimes raised big questions I couldn't explain. That was 2003 that the research started. And I've now been doing this work for 19 years, and it's changed my life and changed the way I work as a physician completely.
Thank you for sharing that. And it has, I imagine, helped many, many, many people have a better understanding of what's possible for them in terms of taking leadership, ownership of their health and well-being, also from a preventative perspective, of course. And so one of the things that you bring up in your book is these 4 pillars for healing, these things that we want to be mindful of. Would you be willing to share what those are?
Yeah, sure. And we can go into them with as much detail as you would like. Every one of them is a huge topic. I spend days teaching on each one of them at times. So a brief introduction is these 4 pillars. Perhaps I should preface by saying, this is the way I've put this together after 19 years of listening to these stories with medical evidence. But this is an early map for an entirely unstudied area for the most part. And I don't want to pretend that this is a complete map. I'm very devoted to doing all I can to enlist others in also mapping this terrain, because it's a really different way of looking at what's possible within all of us. As doctors, we are taught to make a diagnosis and start a medication, but by and large, we don't even ask how people heal. And I can tell you some stories that show just how absurdly that's true. And that's starting to change. We are slowly entering a new era where we actually do begin to ask how people heal and what's possible. But by and large, this has been the disease of diagnosis and medications. So these people are kind of like the super achievers of health and well-being. They're the flagship of what's possible. And so my effort to map here is a start, but I'm really hoping we can get a lot of attention brought to this. The first pillar is nutrition, and that's a big topic. I think there's that trifecta of industry, how that interacts with docs who are asked and reimbursed for signing off on certain results or setting up certain kinds of studies. That interaction is important to understand, as well as how both of those institutions interact with lobbyists and the government around creating recommendations for all of us. That's science, but it's also got a business side to it that I think of it as science with a spin, or spin science. And so we just have to be aware that that's why there's so much confusion around what genuine nutrition is. And if you go on the internet, a person can become really confused because there's so many fad diets. Nutritionists, doctors, nurses, we all have been fed a lot of misinformation about genuine nutrition. And so it's a big topic. The people I study, there's not one monolithic diet that is healing. I think we all come from different parts of the world. We have different microbiomes, different ancestries. I think what's true is the American diet is full of a lot of processed foods and sugars and refined flours that are toxic to what the human body is built for. Over 100 years ago, the average person in the United States consumed 4 pounds of sugar a year. Now the average American consumes 154 pounds of sugar a year. Our bodies just are not equipped to have that kind of load. And what we know from clinical research in the lab is that sugar is inflammatory. And when you have these sharp granules coursing through your bloodstream at a very high density over and over, day in and day out, these little sharp granules cause cuts in the endothelium of our arteries. And that causes the immune system, the brilliant immune cells, to kick in and go in and repair these cuts and create scabs. But over the years, scab on top of scab creates atherosclerosis. And what we have historically called cholesterol is really a problem of chronic inflammation. And that's what underlies a lot of our diseases. So again, there's no monolithic one-size-fits-all diet here, but it is true that most of the people I studied eliminated a lot of the sugars, a lot of the enriched flours that are basically sugar in our system in terms of how our body handles it, a lot of the processed foods. 88% of the people that I've studied went vegetarian, but not everybody did. Some people pursued a more keto diet approach. That's a very big topic in itself, but the common element clearly has been an elimination of things like the sugars and refined flours and the highly processed foods.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think for people who are wanting to be more mindful of their nutrition, it's really important to hear that. And so what are the 3 other pillars?
The other 3, the second one is healing our immune system. That's a big topic in a time of COVID. I think it's just really wonderful and important that we have vaccines, for example. But the concern I have is that we ignore all these other tools in our toolbox that help create very strong immune systems. So I think the more we can help people realize that, as important as vaccines are, there's ways to also boost our immune system. Our immune system is a really big deal, not only for infections and during pandemics or keeping us safe from bacteria and viruses. Our immune systems also keep us safe from cancer and from most other diseases. The immune system is what the brilliant little worker bees of these highly specialized cells are, what go in and catch a mutating cell and try to get these mutating cells eliminated before they grow into cancer, for example. When we were talking a few minutes ago about the chronic inflammation that comes from sugar, for example, coursing through the bloodstream at a really high level, it's the immune cells that are going in and trying to repair these little cuts over and over. Most of the illnesses that people suffer from in the modern age are diseases of chronic inflammation. And so if we want to lower the burden of chronic inflammation in our body, that gives us a huge bulwark against the kinds of diseases that are causing so much suffering. 85% of the diseases that cause suffering in our lives in America and other Western countries are diseases of chronic inflammation. They are autoimmune illnesses where the brilliant cells of the immune system are actually attacking the body instead of the pathogen or working to protect us, because they've gotten confused in the context of all these issues that create the chronic inflammation. So that's a very brief picture of that. I'll tell you a brief story just to help clarify this basic worldview issue. Louis Pasteur was the father of the germ theory. He proved that germs exist and that these germs are associated with disease. That was a brilliant advance for medicine, of course, but he said that germs are the cause of our diseases, and if we can eliminate the germ, you eliminate the disease. a few of his colleagues, Claude Bernard, for example, said, well, let's hold on here. It's a little bit more complicated than that. He said that the pathogen, the germ, is not what causes the disease. He said these diseases can only take root in a system that already has broken down. He said that we are surrounded by bacteria and viruses, for example, millions of bacteria and viruses inside and outside of our bodies every day, every minute. And the only time that they can become invaders is when something breaks down in our system. So Claude Bernard's view was, if you have a pile of trash in your kitchen, would you rather keep waving away the flies or just remove the trash? So he said that if you create a strong, healthy inner terrain, which now we today call the microbiome, you can create a system that's much less susceptible to pathogens and diseases in general. So Claude, being the teacher that he was, he took a glass of cholera in front of his classroom. Cholera was a terrible plague. And he said, I have created a strong inner terrain, again, what we call a microbiome. He said, if I drink this, I'm not going to get ill because I know how to take care of my inner terrain. He drank the cholera. He didn't get sick. And then Louis Pasteur, I think it was the grandson, this has been clearly documented, that on his deathbed, Louis Pasteur did finally admit, he said, you're right, the pathogen is nothing, the terrain is everything. I think we need an understanding of both worldviews because both play a role. There are places where antibiotics, vaccines are just critical, but we have these other really powerful things that we can do that take work, and they are lifestyle related, but they create really robust, strong immune systems that are really powerful. And I think it's just important that we not ignore them in a day when our over-reliance on medications has created a lot of bacterial resistance, for example, and less effective antibiotics, and a rising tide of illness that these treatments, these medicines are not able to stem because we're not paying enough attention to these other reversible or fixable, preventable factors that we could apply.
Yeah. And that's really, really important for people to be aware of, and to be very mindful, as you said, of the microbiome. And you know, it might be new to some people listening that, you know, chronic inflammation is a, you know, kind of related to all of these other diseases, that it's the I don't know if the right word is the root of it or the kind of cause of it. I don't know what's the appropriate word for that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. Yes, it's the immune system that is the common underlying pathway for all the major killers like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune illness, respiratory disease, depression, anxiety. These are all these are autoimmune illnesses where the immune system is attacking the body instead of doing its job efficiently. And so if we can begin reversing the chronic inflammation, we lessen the burden of illness and suffering for everybody in a way that medication will never do.
Yeah. Fascinating. And so what is the third, if you don't mind, pillar?
Third is healing our stress response. And that's a big deal. And I often hear people say, well, if we can eliminate the stress, things will be better. But that's true up to a point, but we can't all eliminate our stresses either. Sometimes sitting in rush hour to get to work is a necessity, or taking care of children who have a lot of needs, or parents who are aging. There's situations where our commitments to people we really love do require that we manage and balance a lot of stressors. So I think it's important to make a distinction between healthy stress and toxic stress. One person might experience running a marathon as terribly stressful and as just a solid release of cortisol and other stress hormones like norepinephrine and adrenaline in a way that's unremitting and not going to be helpful to them. Other people can experience or find a way to relate to running a marathon as a way that is stressful, but also expands their understanding of who they are and their capacities, and can actually eliminate or enlarge their capacity to live with stress. And that's really important for leaders, for example, because leadership is a lot about knowing how to expand one's stress tolerance in a way that's not toxic to one's own physiology. Cured tells stories about people who had to either change their relationship with stress or leave stressful situations. Jan, for example, is the story of a person who lived with lupus and Lyme disease and a number of chronic illnesses starting at age 15 into her 40s, and then went to a healing center, was shocked to experience a healing, came off of 20 medications, and including steroids, which she'd been on for many years. She went back to a marriage and a job that she experienced as toxic, became ill again. And she'd been on death's door, actually. She had lupus in her brain, her kidneys, her heart, and her liver. So she was going into end-stage organ failure when she first arrived at the center. So she was close to death. She recovered in a way that she experienced as miraculous, went back home, relapsed back into illness, went back to this healing center, and then began to realize, wow, there's something about my relationship, my marriage, and my job that's killing me, literally. And she began to realize that the body really does keep the score. The body does tell the story if we have the ears to listen to what our body's trying to tell us. She ended up leaving the marriage, leaving the job, and now has been disease-free, living this blessed, happy life in northern Idaho. She sends me photos regularly, and she changed so fundamentally that she changed her name. Her photographs are so different from who she was when she was ill that she would walk down a street in Idaho and people who she'd known her whole life didn't even recognize her anymore. And so it's really astonishing sometimes how deep these changes go and what it takes to heal, but also what becomes possible when we really do begin to listen to our bodies and realize our bodies are messengers that have something important to say.
That's right. And you wrote in the book, the words that radical healing requires, kind of a radical shift in life, and so it might not be your exact words, but the idea here is you even use the words burn the boat, right? Sometimes it does require us to leave a toxic job or a toxic relationship, or, so that we don't reactivate those same stressors, those same triggers.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, and that's the messy part of this, right? For Jan to leave her marriage, for her to begin to take the messages of her body seriously, I question whether I would have that courage. Would I have the courage and the clarity to finally get it and see what's going on here? Because it requires stepping into a very different way of experiencing oneself, begin valuing oneself. I often tell the story of a woman who I studied who had breast cancer. In the context of her healing, she went from being a demure, very kind and gentle lady into somebody who was more saucy and racy. I'm going to tell you what I really think. She became more comfortable with taking up space in the world, pushing back on people who she decided she needed to set boundaries with or teach to treat her differently. She became a more difficult patient, much less compliant, but
healthier.
But healthier, and she didn't die from her breast cancer. And I see that pattern over and over and over again, that people who are so depleted and run down because they've been spending so much life energy taking care of everyone else and the perceived expectations of others. And I now help people set up selfish bitch projects to help them begin paying attention to their own well-being, because many people are depleted and run down, and that's how their minds and bodies begin to break down.
Yeah. And I imagine that all that toxic stress then creates that chronic inflammation that we spoke about. And it's, that kind of down spiral,
Yep.
especially when we're constantly around those triggers, right? If it's a spouse
Yes.
or a boss, or, you're seeing them every day. And
Yep.
so, it's interesting because when we speak of grief, right, the process of grief, in order to really experience that psychological transition, we must acknowledge the loss, right? The loss of the old identity, the old life, the old relationship, whatever that might be. And we have to have that ending in order to begin to recreate a new identity, give new meaning, new perceptions to the things in our life,
Yeah.
or sometimes say goodbye to things completely that no longer serve us. This is just absolutely fascinating because in my work, I do breakthrough sessions. I, speak with groups about
Wow.
mindset. And I too hear stories, not from a health perspective, but I hear stories about people that, didn't believe that they were good enough for something, let's say to
Right.
start a company, or that things would be hard. And they were able to release that belief, and then opportunities showed up. And we see this consistently, not just in the health world, but the way that we perceive things in our life absolutely does have an effect on our physical reality, including, as you're describing, your health.
Yes, you're right. And Dick Schwartz is one of those who talks, and Stephen Porges also talk about how state creates um, perception in many ways. And I think if our bodies are marinating in the stress hormones of norepinephrine and adrenaline and cortisol, we know on the basis of laboratory and clinical evidence that that is what causes cells to misfire, to make mistakes, to attack the body instead of an external pathogen. And you mentioned before we started talking HRV, and the connection of that is with the parasympathetic state, of course. And when we are in a parasympathetic state and not in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, we are in a state where the hormones are very different. And if our bodily cells and our immune cells are bathed in dopamine, the pleasure pathway, the purpose molecule, or serotonin, the antidepressant molecule, oxytocin, the love molecule, these are molecules and a fluid environment that our body loves. And this is what sets the conditions for healing. The body wants to heal. And when we can get into that kind of state, that's when the conditions are set so that healing can occur. I think too many of us live in fight or flight, and we are more in a sympathetic state of arousal and anxiety and fear. And so learning to get into a more relaxed parasympathetic state is a huge piece of what helps people heal.
Yeah, thank you. And there are a lot of, for those people listening that want to learn how to do this, there are a lot of the episodes of this podcast, things like techniques from the Heart Math Institute, like EFT tapping and havening techniques, and many, many others like it that do. We have much evidence showing that absolutely does create a more coherent heart rate variability pattern and much greater health and ability to heal. So thank you.
Huge.
Thank you. Yeah. So share with us about the fourth pillar, because that's, of course, the one that I'm most excited about. What is that?
Well, and this is the most important one, and the pillar that sometimes is so important in a person's life that even if they don't make the nutritional changes, for example, they still might sometimes experience a healing. And so this was a big one. It's the most complex and difficult one for me to understand, and one that I am most likely going to spend the rest of my life trying to understand better, because it's such a big deal. This is the pillar of healing identity and healing false beliefs, which I know is a huge piece of what you bring and do with your work. We all grow up in our homes. We grow up on the playgrounds of our schools. We pick up beliefs. Some are true, some are false, some are conscious, some are unconscious. And these beliefs are all wrapped around what is our value and our place as a human being. And I think one of the concerns I have is that we create these false hierarchies where we walk down the street and compare ourselves to each other based upon how we look, whether it's the clothing we wear or how old or young we are, or the color of our skin, or our affiliations, or where we work, or how much school we've had or not had. And these are all false hierarchies. We all bring this immortal, perfect wholeness into the world, and we forget that along the way in the context of learning some beliefs where we don't know how to experience the dignity and value that every one of us has. And I think it's the drip, drip, drip of these false beliefs day in and day out, some of which we don't even know how to name, that is what wears our minds and bodies down. I think the truth is, if we have a mixed set of true and false beliefs that we carry around, some of which are conscious and some are unconscious, we are going to have a mixed set of results in our life, and in our minds and our bodies. And so I appreciate the work that you do to help eliminate false beliefs. It's a huge story, and also raises a lot of room for intense discussion about the social issues we're dealing with and leadership issues.
Because when a leader can embrace his or her authentic self and bring that higher elevated energy into the workplace, that does have an effect on other people's beliefs about their own worthiness, about what's possible and not possible for them. And of course, then there's a trickle effect into their families and communities and so on. And so I truly believe that what you write about in the book Cured, that, as I said, I highly recommend, is very relevant for everyone who wants to be not only healthier from a physical perspective, but also from a mental, emotional, spiritual perspective, because the ability to focus on what's right in our life versus what's wrong or not going well or not going quickly enough or well enough is I believe one of the biggest determinants of our ability to heal. And so tell us a little bit more, if you don't mind, around kind of the stories, the research around beliefs and identities, these kind of interpretations, if you will.
Yeah. So which story should I tell? There's a lot of stories here.
They're all great. I remember them. They're all great.
So maybe the story of Claire. I start off Cured with her because I felt like she's kind of every woman in many ways. She's just a simple, grounded, lovely woman who taught me so much. And she was diagnosed by biopsy in 2008 with pancreatic adenocarcinoma, told that she had a year, maybe two to live, and that would be it. She expected to die. She made preparations for that, and decided, since she only had a limited amount of time left, she wasn't going to go sit in doctor's offices with other cancer patients, and wanted to spend the remaining months with those she loved. And that's a long story in itself. She is a woman who valued science, had always followed doctors' recommendations, but since she had limited time left and none of the treatments would do more than lengthen her life by a matter of a few months, she decided to focus on quality of life instead of all the treatments. So that was 2008. In 2013, she had a CT scan of the abdomen for unrelated reasons, and the cancer was gone. Her doctors assumed that the diagnosis must have been wrong, so they called a grand rounds and to look into things. The biopsy had been accurate. It's amazing how doctors react to these things. That's a whole story in itself. In 19 years of research, not a single patient that I've studied has ever had a doctor get curious about how they got better. The good doctors say, well, whatever you're doing, do it. Keep doing it because it's working. But they don't get curious. So that's itself just an
That's
amazing statement.
mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It just shows, and I can tell you a really funny story about that if you wanted.
Yes.
I'll just do it briefly.
Please.
Jill Bolte Taylor is a famous, I think you know who she is. She might have been on your podcast.
Not yet.
She's lovely, and she was a neuroscientist actually at McLean Hospital, where I work, back in the 90s before I was out of med school. But she was a neuroscientist doing a postdoc in neuroanatomy, and she had a stroke and lost most of her left brain. When she and I met, she said, "I've been waiting for you for 22 years. She said, "In 22 years, not a single doctor has ever asked how I got better from my stroke." Now, this is in spite of the fact, so we have a neuroscientist. She had a full recovery from her stroke. She wrote about it and gave the first TED Talk that went viral. She was named by Time Magazine as one of the most important people of 2008. She's had this best-selling book about stroke recovery that's been in something like 30 languages and a bestseller for decades at this point. Oprah was doing a movie on her life. She's got just one thing after another, and yet doctors aren't interested in how she got better. And she did the same things I see over and over and over again.
Wow.
So that's just a funny little anecdote about how powerful the socialization process is for doctors. We are very, I think a lot of us are very well intentioned, but the model and the pressures on doctors are so extreme that they can't easily see outside of their blinders. And that's why we need help engaging this new way of thinking.
And I believe that the big part of what you're doing is just that. It's perhaps creating a little more curiosity. And once they allow themselves to open that box, if you will, that black box, that as you refer to it, including their own black box, not just of their own fears and what that might mean for their careers should they pursue this and be more, open to learning about these miraculous kind of healings, if you will. So, one of the things that you speak about is this idea of the personal transformation. So specifically around identity, I believe it was even Claire that said, I got right with myself. There was some kind of an identity shift. And so for people that are very curious about what that might mean, and what did you see around that? I guess I'm a little bit more curious about what does that actually mean to shift or transform how we view or perceive ourselves?
Yeah, it's a big topic. Maybe one way to walk around this huge topic is to say that, for 14 years, I also, in addition to being medical director at McLean, a psychiatric hospital, I've also been the chief of behavioral medicine at a large urban medical center. Part of what I do there is I talk to people who have been diagnosed with fatal illnesses like incurable cancers. When a person receives a diagnosis like this, of course, it's a terrible time for them to hear this. But more surprising to me has been how frequent it is that a person will be terrified of dying at one level, but at another level, they'll have a more complicated response like, wow, if I only have 6 months to live, I guess I don't have to go to law school like Dad's pushing me to do, or I don't have to take over the family business like my parents expect. Or if I only have 12 months to live, now maybe I can give myself permission to focus on things that create genuine well-being for me instead of spending my life energy taking care of everyone else. That shift, or that death of the that death of the false self in some ways, so that a more authentic version of the self can be born, is a massive deal. The birth of who we really are authentically. It's so easy to believe that we're not good enough, that there's something that's not worthy in how we are. There's something in us, I think, that scans 24/7, looking for an experience of unconditional love. And there's something in us that doesn't rest until we experience that. And ultimately, that has to come from within. How do we remove the blockages in our own life so that we can experience that? That's very associated, I believe, with what the birth of the authentic self is, where we no longer feel a need to appease others, accommodate others to the exclusion of our own needs and well-being. It's a huge, really important topic, but it's at the very core of what this is about.
Yeah, and I'm grateful you actually explained that really well, and I think probably opened some minds to asking themselves, what is it time for me to let go of? Because it is a choice. It takes a lot of courage at times and preparation, of course, but ultimately it's a choice. And I think I heard you share in one of the interviews a quote from Dr. Gabor Mate, who said that if you don't know how to say no, your body will eventually say no for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I appreciate you bringing that up. I believe our medical clinics and hospitals and our psychiatric hospitals are full of people who we have not helped know when to say no and what to say yes to in terms of our own authentic being. I think there is a part in us that is our deeper self, our authentic self, that is whole and complete and even perfect and immortal, if you will. The stories I've seen when a person experiences the fullness and the wholeness of who they are in a way that's separate from all these other false beliefs, when a person makes contact with that, it's shocking sometimes what happens to the physical body as the physical body seems to change to catch up with that. And that's where you get into healings that happen so quick that our medical science has no way to begin understanding it. Yeah. I think that's what's happening is the person's making contact with their self, with their authentic self, that unconditional part of us.
I had one of my CEO clients, probably a gentleman, probably mid-60s, I remember a few years ago, said to me after having released some things, he said, I'm experiencing loving myself for the first time in my whole life now. This is a very successful person, very large company, all the stuff. But said, for the first time in my life, I love myself. And he said, it feels like coming home.
And that creates a very different kind of leadership, right? Because state creates story. And that kind of story creates a really different kind of leadership and business.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing.
Well, Dr. Rediger, I'm so deeply grateful for your work, your commitment to the work, your commitment to having conversations like you're having with us today. It's clearly something that goes beyond a job. It's something that is, I imagine, very much meaning and purpose driven, and you're modeling for us, I believe, what we can all do, right? Find that thing, follow that thing, be curious, and have the courage to pursue that, and stay committed to that, and of course serve others in the process of doing that. So I honor you for serving all of us as you do. And I wish you much continued success in all that you do. And how can people learn more about you? Like I said, highly recommend the book Cured. Where can they go?
My website is drjeffreyrediger.com.
That was it.
It's Rediger.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Rediger. And I really bless all that you do, and wish you much, much well-being in your life.
Well, thank you for what you do as well.